quite simply, no club in Europe who's at all sensible would pay them the wages they're on at Everton.
What is going to happen with the future of some of that squad that is too good to be in that position? Do you think the buy-in with Frank is enough that some of this squad are going to stick around, or do you think there are players who are already eyeing up a move, even if they secure survival?
I think all bets are off until the summer, and that's basically right the way across the board when it comes to Everton right now. That's under 23, the most promising under 23s players signing contracts with Richarlison's future, Pickford, Dominic Calvin-Phillips. I mean, you have to surmise that if you're Jordan Pickford in a World Cup year, you're not going to want to be playing away at Rotherham on a Tuesday night. That's not going to help your England chances before a trip to Qatar. Ditto Richarlison. But then the other side of this is that as Brazil's number 9 wants to be playing for a side that finishes 17th year on year anyway. I mean, is that the extent of Richarlison's ambition? I'd almost be disappointed if it is, by the way, because I think he's such a good player. He's so talented. He's got so much to give that he should be playing in a team with aspirations of at least of qualifying for Europe. Just to address the issue with the flare, I mean, that is under investigation. The FA are looking at that currently. The latest that we've had is that we don't expect anything imminent. We don't expect any news on that imminently. But certainly kind of initial indications are that kind of parties close to the player are confident that he is going to escape sanction. So let's just wait, or should I say a ban, a severe sanction. That would be a disaster if he were to be banned, because I think, like you rightly said, he is Everton's talisman. In the game against Burnley at Turf Moor, he was just about the only one of them stuck his head above the parapet. He was driving Everton on at every opportunity, and since then he's just got better and better. And it was really interesting. Last week, Mark Carey, one of our data guys, obviously he did a piece on the value of a goal, and Richarlison was right at the top for game state altering goals. So he's basically the one that takes the ball by the horns when it comes to Everton. Calvert-Lewin's been injured for most of the season. He's another one of those players, probably with Yerry Mina at centre-back, who you think if he'd been fit for even half of the games, 2/3 of the games, Everton wouldn't be here. They're so important to the side's hopes. Calvert-Lewin is a focal point, Mina is a leader at the back, that they would have had enough to probably be lower mid-table had everyone been fit. But Everton's injury record's been the worst in the league this season. It's right up there with Leeds, and I think more in instances per 90 than Leeds so far this season. So
I find that almost impossible to believe.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm sure Phil's got something to say about that injury. The prize for worst injuries of the season is a competitive one on this podcast, isn't it, Phil?
Yeah, well, another one for Stuart Dallas at the weekend. And when I say another one, I mean another one for Leeds. I mean, Dallas was on a run of 121 starts from 122 league games, and he's been the one player at Leeds who has kind of looked unbreakable and indestructible. But I guess in this season, it's catching up with everybody eventually, and it's a really nasty one for him. He's fractured his femur, which is an extremely unusual injury in football, and you know, very few physios, medical people come across that in this sport, and he'll be looking at a really long stretch. We haven't been given the time scale for that yet, but I think if he's back this side of Christmas, he'll be doing pretty well with that. I mean, similar situation for Leeds. If they go down, they are badly exposed when it comes to players they might lose. They've got Kalvin Phillips, they've got Raphinha. It's a World Cup year. Raphinha has broken into the Brazil squad and has been excellent for them. Kalvin Phillips has been injured for a lot of the season, so hasn't played too much for England recently, but obviously was part of the team right the way through the Euros, all the way to the final, and I think would certainly be in the squad for Qatar. And there's no argument really to be made that either of them should or would be sticking around in the Championship. And I think you can probably say the same about others like Ilamele. There would be big question marks over them. So there is an awful lot at stake. I mean, even beyond that at Leeds, they've got big plans for stadium redevelopment. They've got a season ticket waiting list of 20,000. It's hard to see how all that holds up if they're not in the Premier League, because the Premier League is what drives those sort of things. It's what gives you the money and gives you the scope to make the stadium bigger. It's what makes 20,000 people want to get on board with season tickets that currently aren't available. So yeah, it's a very, very big 4 weeks, 3-4 weeks for Leeds. And I think as well, ultimately, aesthetically, the risk they stand now is that it's going to look as if the work that was done under Bielsa and the massive progress that was made in those 3 years has gone up in smoke if they don't stay up.
Phil makes an interesting point about the consequences of relegation, but particularly from a financial standing. I actually think the big discussion point and the big make or break thing for Everton, if they were to go down, would not be what happens to Calvert-Lewin, Richarlison, Pickford, etc. There would be willing buyers for them, whatever division they're playing in, and probably even more so if they're in the Championship, because clubs would sniff a bargain. The problem Everton will have is that I think they've got the 8th highest wage bill in the Premier League at the moment. Well, that's just absolutely not sustainable, even with parachute payments in the Championship. So you would have to shed a load of, not your top earners, but players below that. So let's say, for example, Yerry Mina, who's injury prone, Mason Holgate, Andre Gomez, who's on a sizable whack after coming in from Barcelona, but very rarely features. And everybody knows he's picked up kind of serious injuries over the last few years. They're the ones that I slightly worry about with Everton. Anyone will take Dominic Calvert-Lewin, anyone will take Richarlison. But what happens to an Andre Gomez if he's in the Championship? And equally then, the knock-on of that is what happens to Everton if they can't get rid of those guys? But you have to find buyers and you have to find people willing to take the wages on. Everton's almost become a destination for players that will get their best ever contract at Goodison. And
because players don't want to move either, do they? That's the problem. If you go down, those players aren't going to get a better contract elsewhere. I saw this with Villa when Villa went down. You get stuck with high earners that you can't shift.
Yeah, and that's been a trend for quite a while, certainly since Farhad Moshiri came in as kind of majority shareholder in 2016. I mean, even now you've got somebody like Cenk Tosun on a decent sum of money, who is just running down his contract with a view to leaving as a free agent over the summer. When they've had to get people off the books to comply with FFP, it's been Bernard to the Middle East, or James Rodriguez again to the Middle East, because quite simply, no club in Europe who's at all sensible would pay them the wages they're on at Everton. And like I say, that these guys are paid far more at Everton than they would be elsewhere. And that's the concern. It's not Calvert-Lewin or Richarlison, but it's a Gomez, or maybe not Yerry Mina, but people like him who are injury prone. So that's why it's so important Everton stay up this year, because then they can look after this shock, after the scare, then they can look at something more sustainable for the future, where maybe they look to instill more relegation clauses into contracts. Kind of
See, my understanding at Leeds is that they're pretty well covered for that, and because they're fairly newly promoted, a lot of the contracts are covered by relegation provisions, which, you know, a sensible club would do. But Everton, having been at that level for so long, and also having probably never thought of themselves as relegation fodder, I would wonder and question, without knowing, how many of the player contracts over there include provisions to reduce wages.
That's what I was thinking as well, actually. Or even a release clauses, which lots of Leeds contracts may have in them when the new players signed. Like, Phil, I was going to ask you, Raphinha, well, you know, obviously a standout player. It's been a tough couple of months for him, but there were already conversations, I think, in January about what was going to happen to him. Where are they now with his future?
Well, if you go back to January, there was a lot of optimism that they were pretty close to getting things done with Raphinha. In his current contract, there's no buyout clause in the Premier League, but from what we're told, there would be one if Leeds go down in this existing deal. Had he signed a new contract, and if he was to get around to signing a new contract at any stage further down the line, there would be a release clause in it. That would be the point of discussion. It kind of works for both sides. Leeds would want it as high as possible. Raphinha would obviously want it as low as possible. But it means that Raphinha can get a move if he really wants a move. It means that Leeds are guaranteed a certain amount of money. I think, like I said, it's actually, there's been a lot of talk about Barcelona and Raphinha, and Barcelona's agent Deco is very, very tight links at the new camp. I think it was hard for people to visualise him staying much beyond the summer anyway. Even if Leeds stayed up, he feels like the one who might go. With Phillips, it's slightly different. They are going to have to agree a new contract with him if they stay up. He's got 2 years left, and you get into that kind of dodgy period where you know that if it runs on much longer, the value of the player diminishes, and you have an asset that's worth nothing like what you should be getting for him. But likewise, if they are a Championship club, I just don't see how that fits with Phillips' vision of where he wants to go and his ambition of the level that he wants to play at, I think it would be nigh on impossible to convince somebody like him that it was a good thing for him to be going back to Championship grounds.